They called her many names. Some whispered with awe, others with spite. Queen, schemer, lover, heretic. But behind those titles was a woman who refused to be forgotten, no matter how many scribes tried to scratch her name from history. She was born into a world of iron and incense, where kings claimed divine right and women were expected to keep their heads bowed. But she had other plans. From the moment she could speak, she questioned what others only dared to pray about. Her eyes, they said, sparkled like glass windows in a cathedral. Beautiful, but hiding something sacred and sharp. She didn't rule from a throne carved in gold, not at first. She ruled from within the rooms where men plotted and drank, where decisions were whispered between gulps of wine. She learned how to listen before she learned how to command. And when the time came, she stepped into the fire of power like she had always belonged there. The church feared her. The kings feared her even more. Because she didn't just follow the rules, she rewrote them. She rode in armor. She led armies. She debated scholars and priests. Her presence was not gentle. It was undeniable. And yet, when you open most history books, she is barely a footnote, as if erasing her would make the world forget she had once ruled with a will so fierce it bent kingdoms. They buried her legacy under the rubble of wars and papal decrees, hoping that silence would do what swords could not. But history is a stubborn thing. It remembers echoes. It remembers those who made the world tremble, even if it can't always say their names. Tonight, we speak her name again. And we begin her story not as legend, but as truth. Soft as candlelight, sharp as steel. She was born under a southern sun, where vineyards curled around stone walls and poets sang of love as if it were war. Her cradle was no simple wooden box. It was a court steeped in song, riddles, and politics. The women in her family didn't just sew, they ruled. And from them she learned that words could wound sharper than blades. Her name was Eleanor. Eleanor of Aquitaine. But to understand her is to forget everything you've been taught about medieval queens. She didn't wait patiently in castles or faint at the sight of blood. She hunted. She danced. She challenged the very idea that women should be quiet. When her father died, she became Duchess of Aquitaine, the richest, wildest, most fiercely independent territory in all of France. And she was still a teenager. Kings began circling like hawks, not because of love, because of land, power, and the gold-stained roads that wound through Aquitaine like veins of influence. She chose Louis, the King of France. Or perhaps she chose the crown itself. Their wedding was not one of romance. It was a treaty stitched in silk. But Eleanor had no intention of playing the obedient queen. She questioned his priests. She defied his courtiers. She traveled on crusade with him, wearing armor beneath her flowing cloak. Some called her reckless, others dangerous, but she was simply awake. Awake to the fragile dance of power that most women were never allowed to join. And when she realized that Louis would never share the crown, only expect her to bow to it, she did something unthinkable. She left. She walked away from the throne of France, And in doing so, she rewrote the destiny not only of her own life, but of Europe itself. Because Eleanor wasn't done with crowns. She was just getting started. When Eleanor returned to Aquitaine, the court buzzed with rumours. A queen who had defied her king, a woman who walked away from the church's golden net of marriage. In those days, such a thing was not just scandalous, it was heresy. But Eleanor didn't hide. She returned to her homeland like a lioness reclaiming her den. Her court became a place unlike any in Europe. Minstrels sang songs of desire and rebellion. Poets whispered verses that dared to challenge the old order. And in every corner, her influence shimmered, sharp as glass, warm as firelight. Then came Henry. He was younger than her, fierce, restless, the kind of man who made the earth beneath him feel less like soil and more like kindling. Where Louis had been slow and cold, Henry burned. Their union wasn't peaceful, it was electric. Within 2 years, he became King of England, and Eleanor, once cast aside as a troublesome queen, wore a new crown. But she was never content to sit quietly beside a man on a throne. She didn't want to be a shadow. She wanted to rule. And Henry, bold, brilliant Henry, expected obedience. Their marriage became a battlefield with no armies, only glances and whispers. Yet Eleanor wasn't powerless. She bore his sons, 5 of them, and in each one she planted a seed, the fire of Aquitaine, the defiance of their mother. She governed lands while Henry waged wars. She managed courts, collected taxes, forged alliances. And when Henry's pride grew too large, she began to see something dangerous flickering in her son's eyes. Something that looked like ambition, like revolution. She knew what it meant to hold power in your hands, and she knew what it meant to lose it. So, when the moment came to choose between her loyalty to a king or to the future of her blood, Eleanor made a decision that would change the world forever. The halls of Henry's court echoed with footsteps that sounded like thunder. His sons were no longer boys. They were heirs, impatient and burning with dreams too big to wait. And behind their restless eyes was their mother's voice, whispering ancient truths. Eleanor didn't preach rebellion. She didn't have to. She simply reminded them of what they were owed, of the lands that would one day be theirs, of the right to rule, not under their father's thumb, but freely, as kings. And so the sons rose. It wasn't a quiet mutiny. It was bold, loud, and bloody. A rebellion not of strangers, but of sons against their father, of a queen against her king. Eleanor had helped shape the strategy, guide the letters, choose the loyalties. She wasn't behind the scenes. She was the storm. But Henry was no fool, and when he discovered the depth of her betrayal, he struck back, not with a sword, but with silence. He had her arrested, no trial, no speech, just a swift, brutal vanishing. Eleanor of Aquitaine disappeared behind stone walls, locked away in castles cold with moss and memory. For 16 long years, she was moved from fortress to fortress, a royal prisoner in everything but name. History, too, tried to forget her. Chroniclers turned their pens toward other stories. Her name faded like ink in the rain. But Eleanor waited and waited. Because she understood something that even kings sometimes forget. Power is not always loud. Sometimes it survives in silence, gathering like dust, waiting for the right breath to rise again. And when Henry finally died, the keys to her prison were placed in her hand. She didn't tremble. She didn't mourn. She walked out into the sunlight, not as a broken woman, but as something far rarer. A queen returned. And the world would learn. She was not finished yet. The world outside had changed. But Eleanor had not softened. Years in stone rooms had carved her patience into something stronger than steel. She emerged from captivity not as a widow in mourning, but as the ruler of an empire teetering on the edge of chaos. Her favorite son, Richard, had taken the throne. The lion-hearted warrior, the crusader. But beneath the chainmail and legend, he still turned to one person when the weight of the crown grew heavy. His mother. While Richard marched across deserts and battled under foreign suns, Eleanor ruled in his name. She rode across kingdoms in her 70s, negotiating treaties, collecting taxes, settling disputes. Her hands signed edicts. Her voice calmed rebellions. When kings faltered, she stood firm. There was something uncanny about her presence. An old woman with a spine of oak and eyes that had seen too many betrayals to blink. No one dared call her powerless. She was the pulse of the realm, the quiet mind behind the lion's roar. But peace in royal blood never lasts. When Richard was captured and held for ransom, Europe trembled. And it was Eleanor, near 80 years old, who rode across enemy lands, silver-haired and cloaked in defiance, to gather his ransom coin by coin. She negotiated with emperors. She stared down threats. She reminded the world that England had a queen still breathing fire. They tried to write her out, to shrink her to a footnote behind the conquests of men. But how do you erase a woman who outlives every war, every king, every whisper against her name? She wasn't just a queen. She was the architect of an age. And in every shadowed corner where the ink of history fades, her silhouette remains, sharp, proud, unforgettable. There's something haunting about a woman who keeps surviving. Eleanor had lived through kings and crusades, through betrayal and imprisonment. She had walked through the ashes of rebellion and emerged with the same quiet dignity that first startled the courts of France. And now, in the twilight of her life, she carried not just memory, but legacy. After Richard came John, a different son, less admired, less noble, but still her blood. Even then, Eleanor remained a force. She didn't vanish into prayer or retreat to a cloister. Instead, she rode once more across the mountains of Castile, negotiating royal marriages, guiding alliances, securing the fragile threads of Europe's future with the same precision she once used to pull kingdoms from the edge of ruin. Her letters reveal her brilliance, written in Latin, fluent, sharp, and unmistakably her. They speak of land and loyalty, of dangers whispered in corridors and promises sealed with ink instead of swords. She advised kings like a tactician and soothed enemies like a poet. Not once did she ask permission to do so. The world called her old, but age had only refined her. She understood the game better than anyone still playing it. And yet, despite everything she had shaped, they kept trying to bury her beneath the exploits of men. Her name tucked beneath Richard's. Her choices framed as reactions to kings rather than as revolutions of her own making. But Eleanor was never anyone's footnote. She was a woman who shaped dynasties across 2 empires. A mother who gave birth to rulers, and then taught them how to wear their crowns. A prisoner who returned more dangerous than ever. A widow who outlived not just her husband, but the very stories they told about women like her. And even now, if you stand quietly in the ruins of Fontevraud Abbey, where her tomb rests beside kings and sons, you might still feel it. That pulse, that presence. Not just a queen. A legend that refused to be erased. They buried her in stone, but they couldn't bury her story. In the great abbey of Fontevraud, Eleanor lies carved in cold marble, her face serene, her hands resting on a book. Not a sword, not a rosary, a book. Because even in death, she dared to be different. She chose to be remembered not for silence or suffering, but for thought, for will, for memory. But for centuries after her passing, the world grew quiet about her. Chroniclers skipped her name. Historians leaned into the myths of her sons. Her life was tucked behind veils of rumor and politics, as though the very idea of a powerful woman unsettled the pages of history. She had ruled over lands greater than any other queen of her time. She had rewritten the rules of marriage, of motherhood, of monarchy itself. And still, she was reduced in whispers to a temptress, a meddler, a shadow behind men's ambitions. But shadows don't outlast the flame. Eleanor's legend refused to fade. It lingered in the courts she shaped, in the music that bloomed under her patronage, in the laws that bore her influence. Even the art of courtly love, so woven into medieval storytelling, sprouted in her halls, where women's voices were not only heard, but celebrated. And now, across centuries, her image begins to sharpen once again. Not as a relic of gossip or war, but as something far more dangerous. A woman who knew her worth. A ruler who defied the script written for her. And perhaps that's what scared them most. That she didn't just survive history. She dared to shape it. To hold power with her own hands. To make kings tremble. To make Europe turn its head. Even now, when we speak her name, it echoes like a secret finally remembered. Eleanor. Not forgotten. Simply waiting. The world Eleanor ruled was one of iron and incense, of blood-soaked borders and divine right. But she moved through it as if she were born from something older. Like the bones of the land itself knew her name. She understood the game of power better than most kings ever would. Not because she was ruthless, but because she was patient. Because she listened. Because she knew how to survive in a world that didn't expect survival from women like her. She watched kings fall, watched sons die, watched empires shift like sand. And through it all, she remained, writing letters, raising heirs, weaving alliances. Her court became a place of poetry and politics, where words danced beside war. And her voice, though often quiet in official records, rang louder than the trumpets that opened royal processions. In her time, women were expected to vanish into the pages of men's stories. Eleanor refused. She stitched her own narrative across every corner of Europe, from the forests of Aquitaine to the cold halls of English castles. Her choices didn't just ripple, they roared. She wasn't content to be the power behind the throne. She built the throne and dared anyone to take it from her. Even in old age, her influence stretched like the roots of an ancient tree. Noble families bent toward her like vines to sunlight. Kings still sought her approval. Enemies still feared her silence. And those who had once tried to lock her away now prayed they'd never find themselves on the other side of her judgment. She had seen too much to believe in fairy tales. Yet somehow she became one, not in sweetness, but in scale, not in myth, but in memory. A story that refused to be told quietly, a life that refused to be erased. She wasn't merely part of history. She was the one who reminded it to keep going. They said her power came from the men she married. But that was only because they couldn't explain the kind of power that doesn't ask for permission. Eleanor didn't rise through luck or beauty. She rose because she understood something no parchment law could capture. How to bend loyalty without breaking it. How to lead without shouting. How to make herself essential in a world that would rather she vanish. Long before queens were crowned beside their kings, Eleanor stood as one in her own right. Long before women could claim inheritance or speak freely in council chambers, she commanded armies, negotiated peace, and defied papal authority. And still, history tried to tuck her away. Maybe because she was too complex, too bold, too unwilling to be one thing. She was the patron of poets and the architect of rebellions. A mother who raised future kings, and a rebel who nearly brought one down. A queen who ruled more than most kings ever would, but never begged for their approval. She had no interest in being likable. She wanted to be remembered. And though the historians may have tried to turn the page, the ink of her life bled through. In the legal reforms she supported. In the cultural revival she sparked. In the image of a queen who wasn't soft-spoken or silent, but sharp as winter air. Some rulers are born in palaces, but Eleanor was forged in the fires of loss, of exile, of betrayal, and in the quiet strength that comes from outliving everyone who underestimated you. And now, when her name is spoken again, it carries something deeper than memory. It carries a warning that even if you bury a woman like Eleanor, she will find her way back. Not just into history, but into legend. They built kingdoms with stone, but Eleanor built hers with words. Not just the ones spoken in courtrooms or whispered in royal chambers, but the ones she didn't say. The pauses, the silences, The way she could sit in a hall of men and make them wonder if she already knew the outcome of a war they hadn't even declared. Power isn't always loud. Sometimes it's in the quiet decisions made behind thick wooden doors. Sometimes it's in knowing which alliance to tighten and which to let unravel, thread by thread. Eleanor had a gift for that. She moved through court life like a chess master, never rushed, never careless. Every marriage she arranged, every scroll she sealed, every journey she took, it was all part of something larger. She was thinking decades ahead, when others couldn't see past the next battle. And yet, for all her strategy, she was never hollow. There was heart in her rule. She loved fiercely. She fought for her children, even when they turned against each other. She bore the grief of lost sons, of broken promises, of betrayals carried out in her own name. And still, she kept going. She ruled when she was young, she ruled when she was old, and somewhere in between, she showed the world what a woman with vision could really do. They tried to write her out because she didn't fit the mold. She wasn't soft enough to be their ideal queen. She wasn't quiet enough to be forgotten. She wasn't cruel enough to be a villain. She was something rarer, something history didn't know how to name. So instead, it tried to erase her. But you can't erase a woman who never stopped writing her own story. And now, centuries later, we're reading it again. Line by line, some queens are remembered for their crowns, others for their scandals. But Eleanor, she's remembered for the echo. The one that still lingers in the halls she walked, in the laws she touched, in the bloodlines she left behind. She didn't just shape the Middle Ages. She stitched its very fabric, then dared to pull the thread when it didn't fit. And yet, for generations, her story was softened, rounded, diminished. As if the truth of who she was too sharp, too uncomfortable. They called her ambitious like it was an insult. They spoke of her beauty, her lovers, her sons, as if her worth existed only in relation to men. But Eleanor knew better. She knew that real power wasn't inherited. It was practiced, grown, earned every day in decisions most people never even see. She knew how to sit across from popes, from emperors, from generals, and never blink. And more than anything, she knew how to wait. To survive long enough to see the world finally understand what she had known all along. That she was never just a supporting character in someone else's legend. She was the story. When her enemies tried to silence her, she answered with alliances. When they locked her away, she answered with patience. When they tried to forget her, she answered by shaping the future so deeply they couldn't help but walk through it. And now, as history turns its gaze back toward her, the truth becomes harder to ignore. Not a myth, not a muse, a queen, a ruler, a woman who refused to disappear. If you ever find yourself in the quiet valley where Eleanor rests, the wind sounds different. It moves through the abbey stones like breath through an old cathedral, soft, steady, unshaken by time. Her tomb lies beside the kings she outlived, her hands still carved around a book, as if she's waiting for the world to keep reading. And we are. Because Eleanor of Aquitaine was never just one thing. She was a daughter who defied tradition, a wife who walked away from a throne, a queen who dared to govern as an equal, a prisoner who outlived her jailer, a mother who raised rulers, rebels, and legends. And through it all, she was a woman unafraid to lead, unafraid to lose, unafraid to begin again. Her life wasn't neat, it wasn't tame, but it was hers. In a world built to erase women like her, she carved her name deep into kingdoms, into culture, into memory. And now, centuries later, when we speak of her, it isn't just out of curiosity, it's out of recognition. Because she reminds us that true power is not given, it is claimed. And even when history tries to forget, some voices are too strong to vanish. Eleanor didn't fade. She endured. She ruled. And no matter how many pages turned without her name, she's still here, etched into every story that refuses to be silenced.